My son's fraud ruined me, lost everything I built. No job, no trust, ended up waitressing. One day he came, rich, arrogant, smirking. "Advice, waitress?" he mocked. I saw his papers. A huge mistake hidden. Bankrupt in 6 months. He laughed, walked away. Next morning, my doorbell rang. The rain hadn't stopped for 2 days. But inside the small diner, the world was bright with chatter, clinking cups and the smell of frying eggs. A woman in her early 60s moved between tables with quiet grace, her silver hair tied back in a neat bun. Her name tag read, Margaret. No one ever asked for her last name. No one cared. Once she had a last name that opened doors. Collins, a name that appeared in business magazines beside words like visionary, financial genius, and Wall Street's quiet queen. But that was before the scandal. Before her son's mistake became her downfall. It had started 3 years earlier. Her company, Collins Capital, had managed billions for global investors. Her clients trusted her judgment, her calm intellect, her steady predictions. She had spent 30 years building a fortress of credibility, and then, in less than 3 weeks, it was all gone. Her son, Daniel, a 27-year-old prodigy she had once proudly called her successor, had used the company's trust funds to back an unverified cryptocurrency venture. It promised astronomical returns and collapsed overnight. When the truth surfaced, the media didn't care that she hadn't approved the transaction. The headlines were merciless. Mother and son duo crash Wall Street. Fund. Collins Capital under fraud. Investigation. She had built an empire on integrity and lost it because of love. By the time she fired Daniel and launched an internal audit, investors had fled. The board dissolved within weeks. Lawsuits followed, not against her son, but against her, the company's founder and face. Daniel disappeared before the hearings even began. She hadn't heard from him since. Months later, Margaret's townhouse was sold to cover legal debts. Her retirement fund was frozen pending investigation. Her friends avoided her calls. Only silence remained, and the quiet hum of the city that had already forgotten her name. She tried applying for consulting work, but the moment recruiters saw Collins Capital on her resume, they smiled politely and said they'd get back to her. They never did. The world she had once ruled had closed its doors forever. She found the diner job by accident. A small, independently owned cafe on 7th Avenue, run by a kind woman named Clara who didn't ask questions. Clara just looked at her steady hands and said, "You look like someone who won't drop the coffee." And so Margaret became Maggie, a waitress, invisible to everyone except those who wanted their breakfast fast and their refills free. Each morning, she would walk through the drizzle, her worn shoes squeaking on the pavement. The bell above the door would ring as she entered the diner, and she'd tie her apron, ready for another day of quiet anonymity. But behind that calm, her mind never stopped working. She couldn't help it. Every bill, every menu layout, every supplier invoice she saw, she mentally optimized. She'd once handled million-dollar portfolios. Now she balanced trays, but she still thought like a strategist. It was on one of those gray mornings, midweek, that he walked in. He was impossible to miss. Tall, confident, dressed in a tailored navy suit that probably cost more than her old car. He had the kind of arrogance that filled a room before he even spoke. His watch gleamed under the fluorescent light. He slid into a booth near the window, opened a sleek leather briefcase, and began spreading out papers across the table. Financial reports, market charts, her old language. Margaret carried a pot of coffee to his table. "Coffee?" she asked softly. He didn't look up. "Sure, black." She poured it carefully, trying not to stare at the documents, but numbers had always called to her. She recognized balance sheets when she saw them. He glanced at her name tag. "Thanks, Margaret," he said absently, then smirked. "Never thought I'd see someone studying my reports while pouring coffee." She froze for a second, then smiled politely. "Just a habit," she said. "Old jobs die hard," he chuckled. "What was it? Accounting?" She hesitated. Something like that. Let me guess, he said, eyes gleaming with amusement. You were one of those corporate types before the economy got tough? Margaret didn't answer. She didn't owe him her story. He tapped one of the pages. I'm Harold Fletcher. Fletcher Holdings. We're expanding aggressively, trying to double revenue by next year. There it was again. That boastful tone, so familiar. She had met hundreds like him. Men who thought confidence equaled intelligence. She glanced down at his spreadsheet. One number, one ratio, jumped out immediately. The debt-to-asset ratio was spiraling. She frowned slightly, he noticed. Something wrong? He asked, amused. Margaret hesitated, then said quietly, That projection won't hold. He raised an eyebrow. Excuse me? You're over-leveraged, she said softly. If interest rates move even 1%, your cash flow collapses. Harold laughed out loud, genuinely entertained. Financial advice from a waitress? That's a first. Her expression didn't change. It's your business, she said calmly, turning away. He called after her, still grinning. I'll keep that in mind, Maggie the Money Whisperer. That night, after her shift, Margaret sat alone at her small apartment's kitchen table. The rain still tapped against the glass. She took out an old notebook, one of the few things she'd kept from her office. Inside were sketches of companies, numbers, predictions, the kind of analysis she once did daily. She wrote his name on a page, Harold Fletcher. Then she began to calculate. She couldn't help it. She wanted to know. Within minutes, she'd reconstructed his balance from memory. His company's expansion strategy was too aggressive. Too much borrowed money. Too little liquidity. One shift in the market, one missed payment, and it would all collapse. She sighed, closed the notebook, and pushed it aside. Not my problem, she whispered to herself. But the thought wouldn't leave. The next morning, Harold came back. Same table, same smug confidence. Morning, Maggie, he said. You were right about one thing. I am over-leveraged. But don't worry. I've got connections. Money fixes everything. Margaret smiled faintly. Sometimes, she said. Until it doesn't, he grinned. You really think I'll go bankrupt, huh? She hesitated, then looked him in the eye. Yes, she said softly. In 6 months, the laughter that followed filled the diner. Even Clara peeked from behind the counter, smiling awkwardly. Harold chuckled, slapped a tip on the table, and said, I'll send you a postcard from my yacht. He walked out, still laughing. That night, Margaret sat by her window, the city lights glowing below. She hadn't meant to say it, but she'd seen too many companies die to ignore the pattern. Fletcher Holdings was a house of cards, and yet part of her regretted speaking up. People like him never believed people like her. She turned off the lamp and tried to sleep, but as she drifted into uneasy dreams, her mind replayed his smirk, and somewhere, deep inside, a part of her that had long been silent began to awaken. The part that had once fought for empires, predicted crashes before they happened, and rebuilt fortunes from ashes. The part that had been humiliated, silenced and buried, but not destroyed. 3 months later, a familiar sound woke her at dawn. A knock on her apartment door, firm, repeated, urgent. She opened it. Startled, Harold Fletcher stood there. The same suit, but the confidence was gone. His tie was loose, his eyes sleepless, his voice shaking. You were right, he said quietly. Everything's falling apart. The story was only beginning. You were right, Harold repeated, standing in the hallway, drenched from the morning rain. His once pristine suit looked wrinkled and defeated. Everything's falling apart. Margaret stared at him for a moment, unsure whether to let him in. The sight of him, this arrogant man brought low, stirred something deep in her. Not satisfaction exactly, but a quiet recognition of fate's irony. The universe had a cruel sense of humor. She stepped aside. Come in, she said finally. Harold hesitated, then crossed the threshold. Inside, her apartment was small, but neat. A single plant by the window, a second-hand table covered with papers, and a kettle steaming on the stove. He looked around as if trying to place the fragments of her life into a story he could understand. "I don't understand how this happened," he muttered, pacing. "Everything was fine 3 months ago. Now the banks are pulling credit lines. Partners are demanding buyouts. It's chaos." Margaret folded her arms. "Did you change your strategy like I suggested?" He froze. "You were serious about that?" Her eyes narrowed. "I don't joke about numbers." For a moment, he said nothing. Then, almost laughing at himself, he sat down. "You really think you can fix this?" "I didn't say that," she replied. "But I know where the fire started." He leaned forward, desperate now. "I'll pay you." "Whatever you want," Margaret raised an eyebrow. "You can't afford me." Silence hung between them. Then she sighed and poured him a cup of tea. "Show me your books." For the next 3 hours, her small kitchen transformed into a war room. Harold spread out papers, digital printouts, and contracts, while Margaret sat with her reading glasses perched on the end of her nose, scanning every line. Her mind sharpened, the old instincts returning with frightening precision. Within minutes, she began circling numbers, underlining dates, muttering to herself. "Who approved this acquisition? Why are you carrying this much unsecured debt? And why on earth would you guarantee a merger with only 6 months of liquidity?" Harold rubbed his temples. "My CFO said—" "Your CFO," she cut in sharply, "should have been fired yesterday." He blinked. The meek waitress had vanished. Sitting before him now was someone else. Someone whose presence commanded authority. "You've been running an expansion on borrowed momentum," she said. "And your competitors know it. They're waiting for you to stumble." He slumped in his chair. "So what do I do?" Margaret leaned back, thinking. "Cut the liabilities. Cancel the foreign investment deal before it matures. And find a buyer for your non-core assets before the auditors smell blood." He frowned. "That'll make me look desperate." "You are desperate," she said calmly. "But at least this way, you'll survive." When Harold left that morning, the rain had stopped. The sky was a soft gray, and for the first time in months, Margaret felt something close to purpose. He returned the next day. And the next? Each time he brought more documents, more updates. They worked quietly in her apartment, side by side. A fallen executive and a humbled tycoon, rebuilding what pride had almost destroyed. Slowly, their relationship shifted. Harold began asking questions not just about his business, but about her. "You used to do this for a living, didn't you?" he asked one afternoon. She nodded, but her gaze stayed on the papers. "Long time ago. What happened?" She paused. "My son," she said simply. "He made a mistake. I paid for it." Harold said nothing after that, only nodded. But the respect in his eyes deepened. The mocking tone he once carried was gone, replaced by quiet admiration. Weeks passed. Margaret's apartment became a secret office. Late at night, she'd run projections, create contingency plans, and mark turning points on her chalkboard wall. Harold executed each step exactly as she outlined, and it worked. Slowly, Fletcher Holdings began to stabilize. Debt pressure eased. Investors regained confidence. The bleeding stopped. One evening, Harold arrived with a small smile and 2 coffees. "We just closed the asset sale," he said. $32 million. Enough to keep operations running another year. Margaret allowed herself a rare smile. "Good, that buys you time. Don't waste it." He looked at her with a strange mix of gratitude and disbelief. "You saved my company." She shook her head. "You saved it. I just told you where to dig," but he didn't look away. "You're more than a waitress, Margaret." Her chest tightened slightly. "I used to be more," she said. "Now I'm just someone who knows what happens when pride runs the numbers." A week later, Harold insisted she attend a private investor meeting with him. She refused twice. The third time, he showed up with a navy blue blazer and said, "It's time people see who you really are." The meeting was at the Empire Tower, the same building where her old firm once operated. Walking through those glass doors again made her stomach twist. Memories of cameras, headlines, betrayal. She nearly turned back, but Harold placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. Inside, a dozen investors sat around a long glass table. They looked skeptical, until Margaret began to speak. Her voice, calm but commanding, filled the room. She broke down complex financial structures like puzzles, exposed inefficiencies in their current strategies, and proposed solutions that stunned them into silence. When she finished, no one laughed. No one doubted. The oldest investor leaned forward. "And you're telling me this woman works in a diner?" Harold smiled faintly. "Not anymore." That night after the meeting, they walked along the quiet street outside. The city shimmered under the streetlights. Harold stopped beside a lamppost, his breath visible in the cold air. "Margaret," he said softly, "I owe you everything." She shook her head. "You owe me nothing. I just gave you the truth." He studied her for a moment. "Then let me give you something in return." He handed her an envelope, a consulting contract with Fletcher Holdings. Her salary was more than she had earned in her best years. "I can't," she began. "Yes, you can," he interrupted. "You're the reason this company still exists. You belong in this world, Margaret, not hiding behind an apron." She looked at the paper, then at him. "If I sign this, people will start asking questions. They'll find out who I am. And when they do, they'll remember everything, the fraud, the scandal." "Then let them," he said. "The truth doesn't scare me." For the first time in years, she let herself believe that maybe it didn't have to scare her either. Later that night, as she sat at her kitchen table again, she ran her hand over the crisp contract. Her name printed on it felt strange, almost sacred. Margaret Collins, Senior Financial Advisor. It felt like reclaiming a piece of herself that had been buried beneath shame and survival. But something gnawed at her. If Harold's crisis had proven one thing, it was that truth always comes due. And somewhere out there, her son still carried the debt of his own mistakes. As the city lights flickered below, she whispered to the empty room, "Daniel, wherever you are this time, I'm not cleaning up your mess." She closed the contract, exhaled, and allowed herself a small, tired smile. Because for the first time in years, Margaret Collins wasn't falling anymore. She was rising. The following weeks passed in a blur of meetings, contracts, and boardroom debates. Margaret found herself once again navigating a world she thought she'd left behind. A world of polished suits, power plays, and quiet ambition. But this time she wasn't a pawn. She was the architect. Under her guidance, Fletcher Holdings began to transform. Margins stabilized. Investors returned. The board, once skeptical of Harold's sudden comeback, now viewed him with renewed respect. And behind every successful decision, Margaret's invisible fingerprints lingered, yet no amount of progress could silence the quiet dread that followed her home each night. Because she knew it was only a matter of time before someone recognized her, not as Margaret Collins, consultant, but as Margaret Collins, the mother of Daniel Collins, the man whose scandal had burned through headlines like wildfire. One afternoon, while she was reviewing quarterly projections, Harold walked in holding a newspaper. His face was pale. "You should see this," he said quietly. The front page screamed with nostalgia and venom. "Disgraced ex-analyst's son released from federal custody." Her heart stopped. There it was, Daniel's name, printed in bold, underlined by years of judgment. The article went on to say he had been released early for good behavior and was expected to rebuild his life away from the financial world. But the damage had already been done. "Daniel's out," she murmured. Harold nodded. "He'll probably want to see you." "I doubt it." Her voice was calm, but her fingers trembled as she folded the paper. He made his choices. Harold watched her for a moment, then said, "So did you, Margaret. And look where it brought you." She didn't reply. Instead, she stared out the window at the gray city skyline, her reflection framed in the glass. Half shadow, half survivor. That evening, she sat in her kitchen, staring at her phone. One missed call. Unknown number. A voicemail followed, his voice. Older, rougher, but unmistakably Daniel. "Mom, I don't expect you to forgive me. I just want to see you. Please. Her eyes stung. Years of silence pressed down on her chest. She pressed play again, just to hear his voice once more. The next day, she met him. Daniel looked thinner, sharper, a man shaped by regret and sleepless nights. His eyes carried the same mix of defiance and apology that had once driven her to exhaustion. They met in a quiet park near the river. No cameras, no whispers. Just wind and truth. You look good, he said hesitantly. I look tired, she replied. You look older, he nodded. Prison does that. She studied him carefully. Why now? Because I heard you're back, he said. Working again? Helping that billionaire everyone's talking about, she frowned. You've been following me? Not exactly, he said. News travels. People talk, she sighed. What do you want, Daniel? He hesitated. A chance to make things right. Her chest tightened. You can't fix what's already burned. Maybe not, he said, stepping closer. But I can stop it from burning again. Over the following days, Daniel began visiting her apartment, cautiously at first. He'd bring groceries, sometimes coffee, and stay for hours, listening as she worked. Slowly, the invisible wall between them began to crack. But Harold wasn't blind. He noticed the change, the distant look in her eyes, the distraction in her tone. One evening, after a long board meeting, Harold asked her to stay behind. Who is he? He asked bluntly. She froze. Who? The man who's been picking you up lately. The one waiting outside in that old black sedan? Margaret sighed. That's my son. Harold's jaw tightened. The son? Yes, she said softly. The one who destroyed everything. Silence filled the room. Harold leaned against the desk, exhaling. Margaret, I don't care about your past. But if you bring him into this world again, people will use it against you. And against me. I'm not bringing him in, she said firmly. He's just trying to rebuild. Harold nodded slowly, though his eyes stayed clouded. Just be careful. The same people who forgave me won't forgive him. But Daniel wasn't content to stay in the shadows. One night, he showed up unannounced, holding a flash drive. His voice trembled with urgency. Mom, you need to see this. What is it? He plugged it into her laptop. Screens lit up with spreadsheets, transfers, and hidden accounts. Harold's company went, it's not clean. Someone's been funneling money through offshore shells. Margaret frowned. That's impossible. I've seen every audit. Not these, he said, clicking through encrypted files. I got them from a former associate of his CFO. Her stomach twisted. Numbers didn't lie, and these numbers screamed betrayal. Why are you showing me this? She whispered. Because I don't want you getting burned again, he said. This man isn't who you think he is. She stared at the screen, at the data that threatened to undo everything she had rebuilt. The irony was almost cruel. The mother who once lost everything because of her son's fraud was now being warned by that same son. That night, she couldn't sleep. The city hummed outside her window, distant and indifferent. She kept replaying Daniel's words, the files, Harold's warnings. Could she really trust Harold? Or was this another trap, another man using her brilliance for his gain? Her phone buzzed. A message from Harold. Need you at the office early tomorrow. Important. Her heart pounded. She replied, I'll be there. But as she turned off the lights, her gaze fell on the flash drive still glowing faintly on her desk. Some truths. She knew, waited patiently, until the right moment to destroy, and in her gut. Margaret felt that moment approaching fast. By dawn, rain had begun to fall again, the same gray drizzle as the day Harold first appeared at her door. She stood by the window holding the flash drive. Watching the city drown in mist, her reflection stared back, older, wiser, and more dangerous. I won't let anyone use me again, she whispered. Then she picked up her coat and left, the flash drive burning cold in her hand. Because this time, Margaret Collins wasn't the victim of someone else's story. She was writing her own, and she was just getting started. The elevator doors slid open with a soft chime, revealing the gleaming floor of Fletcher Holdings' executive office. Margaret stepped out, heels clicking against polished marble. In one hand, she carried her leather binder. In the other, the small flash drive Daniel had given her. It felt heavier than it should have, like a secret struggling to stay hidden. Harold's assistant greeted her nervously. "He's in the boardroom." "Everyone's waiting." "Everyone." That wasn't part of the plan. Margaret entered the room to find the entire board seated, a dozen sharp faces, their eyes moving between her and Harold. He stood near the projector, pacing, tension etched across his jaw. "Margaret," he said as she entered, voice clipped. "I was just telling them about the upcoming audit. We need to prepare ahead of time." She forced a smile. "Of course," but her eyes caught a glimpse of the spreadsheets projected on the wall, numbers that didn't match the ones she'd reviewed last week. The missing funds, the offshore accounts Daniel had shown her, were all neatly disguised here. Someone had rewritten everything. Her pulse quickened. "Harold," she said softly, stepping closer. "These figures, they've been modified." He froze. "What are you talking about?" "Revenue streams from Q2, she said, pointing. "They've been inflated. Look here, the Cayman subsidiary. It's hiding losses." A murmur rippled through the board. Harold's eyes darkened. "That's confidential data, Margaret. You shouldn't even have access to those numbers." "I didn't need access," she replied calmly. "I just know when numbers lie." The room fell silent. The tension was thick enough to cut. Harold took a slow step toward her. "Let's talk privately," he said through clenched teeth. She hesitated, then followed him out. In his office, the door shut with a quiet click. Harold turned, his composure breaking. "Where did you get that information?" "I didn't hack your systems," she said. "Someone came to me, someone who cares about me." "Your son?" he said flatly. She nodded. Harold exhaled sharply, pacing. "Do you have any idea what this looks like? You bring him into this company, and suddenly sensitive data leaks out? The same Daniel Collins who defrauded half of Wall Street?" Margaret's eyes flashed. "Don't you dare talk about him like that. He made mistakes, but he's not a thief anymore." Harold stopped pacing and looked at her, not with anger, but with pity. "You think I'm stealing, Margaret?" "After everything we built? I think," she said carefully, "that someone inside this company is using you. And if you don't know who, then you're already in danger." He stared at her for a long time, then turned toward the window. Rain streaked the glass like veins of silver. "Do you trust him?" Harold asked quietly. "I don't know," she admitted. "Then you can't trust me either," he said. That night, Margaret returned home, exhausted. The apartment was dark except for the soft glow of her desk lamp. Daniel sat by the window watching the rain. "Well?" he asked. "Did you tell him?" She set the flash drive down. "I confronted him." "He denied everything," Daniel scoffed. "Of course he did. Men like him never admit the truth. Be careful," she warned. "I don't want you involved any more than you already are." He leaned forward. "You think you can play both sides, Mom? You think you can save him and protect yourself? He's using you, just like everyone else did." Her voice hardened. "I'm not that naive anymore." Daniel stood. "Then prove it. Go public." Margaret looked at him, tired and heavy-hearted. "And destroy the one man who gave me a second chance?" "You don't owe him anything," Daniel said. "You owe yourself the truth." For the next few days, Margaret kept to herself. She came to the office early, left late, and combed through the company's data in silence. Every trail led to the same pattern: unreported transfers, cleverly concealed under subsidiaries and charitable fronts. It was clean, but not invisible. One evening, she stayed long after everyone had gone. The hum of the city below was the only sound. She slid the flash drive into her laptop and began cross-referencing Harold's accounts. The numbers aligned perfectly, too perfectly. It wasn't just Harold's CFO covering tracks. It was Harold himself. A soft knock at the door made her jump. "Working late again?" Harold's voice came from the doorway. She closed the laptop, forcing a calm smile. "Old habits." He stepped closer. "You're hiding something." "So are you," she said quietly. He tilted his head, almost smiling. You think I'm stealing my own money? I think you're hiding where it came from. For a long moment, neither spoke. Rain lashed against the windows again. It always seemed to rain when the truth hovered near. Harold sighed, moving to pour himself a drink. You know what your problem is, Margaret. You don't know when to stop fighting ghosts. You lost everything once, and now you're addicted to saving people. Me, your son. Anyone who reminds you of yourself. Don't twist this, she said. You built this company on lies, he smiled faintly. And you built your last one on trust. How did that turn out? The words cut deep. Margaret stepped closer, her voice low but steady. If I find proof, Harold, I'll bring you down myself. He looked at her, and for the first time, his smile faded. I believe you, he said quietly. The next morning, Harold called a press conference. Margaret arrived at the building to find cameras swarming outside. Flashbulbs popped like lightning. The banner read, Fletcher Holdings announces major internal audit. Her heart sank. He was striking first. Inside, Harold stood at the podium, calm and composed. We at Fletcher Holdings value transparency, he began. But recent leaks suggest confidential information has been stolen by an external party with intent to damage this company. Margaret froze. She knew where this was going. Harold continued. It appears this data breach originated from an employee, one who previously faced legal scrutiny for financial misconduct. Whispers spread through the crowd. All eyes turned toward her. Margaret Collins, he said finally, has been placed under investigation pending review of her activities. The room erupted in chaos. Reporters shouted questions. Cameras turned. Her world tilted again. The same humiliation, the same disbelief, the same suffocating heat of betrayal. She couldn't breathe. As security escorted her from the building, flashes of light burned her vision. Again, she thought bitterly. History always repeats itself. That night, the story broke across every major network. Collins involved in another corporate scandal. Once fallen advisor accused of data theft. She sat alone in her apartment, the television's blue glow flickering across her face. Daniel paced the floor in fury. I told you, he shouted. I told you he'd betray you. Margaret said nothing. She just stared at the screen, her name once again synonymous with disgrace. Daniel slammed his fist on the table. We can fight this. You still have the files. She looked up slowly. If I use them, I prove I stole them. Either way, I lose. He crouched beside her chair. Then we expose him, together. Her eyes met his. You want revenge. I want justice. She exhaled, trembling. Sometimes they look the same. For 2 days, Margaret vanished from sight. Reporters camped outside her building. The city buzzed with speculation. Fletcher Holdings stock dropped 14% in a single morning. Harold appeared on financial news channels, expressing disappointment and shock. But behind the scenes, Margaret worked. She and Daniel holed up in a small motel room on the city's edge. Laptops open, files spread across the bed. She had enough proof now. Proof of every hidden transfer, every offshore shell, every falsified audit. This will destroy him, Daniel said, scrolling through the data. Margaret nodded. And me with him. Then what's the plan? She leaned back, staring at the cracked ceiling. We don't destroy him. We make him confess. The next morning, she sent Harold a message. Meet me one last time. Rooftop of Empire Tower. Midnight. It was the same building where she'd reclaimed her career months ago. Poetic symmetry for the end of their story. When Harold arrived, the city glowed beneath them like a sea of fire. The wind howled through the steel beams. He found her standing near the edge, calm, unafraid. You're braver than I thought, he said. And you're more predictable than I hoped, she replied, holding up the flash drive. You built your empire on stolen money, Harold. Offshore accounts, fake audits, it's all here, he sighed. You really think you can blackmail me? No, she said softly. I think I can save you, if you tell the truth. He laughed bitterly. You're still trying to fix everything. Even now. I'm not fixing you, she said. I'm fixing me. He stepped closer, eyes dark. You won't ruin me, Margaret. You don't have it in you. She looked at him. The man who had mocked her once, needed her later, and betrayed her now. You're wrong, she said. I just learned from the best. She pressed a button on her phone. Somewhere below, in a parked car, Daniel began recording as the hidden microphone transmitted every word. Harold froze. You're recording this? I told you, she said quietly. I'm done being the victim. For the first time, his mask cracked. You'll regret this, she smiled faintly. Maybe, but at least it'll be my choice this time. An hour later, as dawn broke over the skyline, the recording was already on its way to every major news outlet in the country. The headline hit before noon. Leaked recording exposes Fletcher Holdings fraud. CEO admits cover-up. Harold was arrested within days. Investors fled, but Margaret didn't run. She walked into the police station herself, carrying the same flash drive, and handed it over. For the record, she told them, I was never the thief. The world had shifted overnight. Fletcher Holdings' name dominated every headline, every news feed, every whispered conversation on trading floors. The mighty empire Harold had built over 2 decades crumbled like glass under the weight of truth. Margaret watched it unfold from her apartment window, not with triumph, but with quiet disbelief. Her phone buzzed nonstop. Journalists, ex-colleagues, legal advisors, old enemies now pretending to be friends. She ignored them all. In her mind, the storm wasn't over. Not yet, because she knew the truth about corruption. It never dies cleanly. It leaves roots, hidden and alive, waiting for their chance to grow back. 3 days later, Daniel met her in a small cafe uptown. The rain had finally stopped, but puddles still mirrored the city's fractured skyline. They froze Harold's assets, Daniel said, scrolling through his phone. The company's board voted him out. He's officially done. Margaret stirred her coffee slowly. And the employees? They're scared. But some are speaking out. Apparently he wasn't the only one. She looked up. You mean there's more? He nodded. The CFO, Patricia. She's been shredding documents for days. She's next. Margaret sighed, rubbing her temples. Then it's not over. Daniel leaned back. Mom, you did your part. You exposed him. You don't need to keep digging. Her eyes hardened. He wasn't the only one who tried to bury me, Daniel. There are still people out there who think I don't deserve a voice. Until every one of them knows the truth, I can't stop. He frowned. You sound like him now. Maybe, she said. But the difference is, I know when to stop lying. That evening, Margaret received a message from an unknown number. Meet me. If you want to know the rest. Attached was a location pin, the old marina on the outskirts of the city, a place she hadn't visited in years. Daniel warned her not to go. It's a setup, he said. Maybe, she replied. But if there's one thing I've learned, it's that the truth never shows up uninvited. She went alone. The marina was deserted, waves slapping against wooden docks like muffled applause. The smell of salt and rust hung thick in the air. Patricia was waiting near an old yacht, her hair pulled back, her face pale under the dim lights. You came, she said softly. I usually do, Margaret replied. What do you want? Patricia glanced around nervously. Harold wasn't the beginning. He was the middle. The board's been laundering money for years. Political donations, shell charities, offshore campaigns. He took the blame because he thought he could buy his way out. Why tell me this now? Margaret asked. Patricia's voice trembled. Because you've already burned the house down. I might as well hand you the ashes. She handed over a small folder. Inside were handwritten notes, transaction codes, and emails implicating several high-level officials, people far beyond Fletcher Holdings. This could start a war, Margaret whispered. Patricia nodded. You wanted the truth. Here it is. By the time Margaret returned home, it was past midnight. Daniel was pacing the living room. You shouldn't have gone alone, he shouted. What if she didn't? Margaret interrupted, setting the folder on the table. But she gave us something else. Something bigger. He picked it up, flipping through the pages. This is insane. If this gets out, half the city's elite will go down. That's the point. He looked up, worry in his eyes. And what about us? You think they'll let you walk away after this? She smiled faintly. I don't plan on walking. I plan on running straight through. The next week was a blur of sleepless nights and careful planning. Margaret coordinated with a group of independent journalists, the same ones who had once crucified her name. They met in hidden offices, encrypted chats, anonymous phone calls. Every document was verified, every trail followed. The evidence pointed to something monstrous, a web of bribery, manipulation, and offshore collusion involving senators, judges, and business magnates. Harold's empire had been just one piece of a much larger machine. When the first exposé dropped, the city erupted again. But this time, it wasn't just Fletcher Holdings in the crossfire. It was everyone. Days later, Margaret stood outside the courthouse as news vans lined the street. Patricia had been arrested. Several politicians resigned within hours. Protesters shouted slogans demanding reform. Daniel stood beside her, watching the chaos unfold. You did it, he said quietly. She shook her head. No, we did it. And now we deal with the fallout. As if on cue, her phone buzzed again. A number she didn't recognize. She answered. Mrs. Collins, a cold voice said. You've made powerful enemies. Good, she replied. Means I hit the right ones. The line went dead. That night, Margaret returned to the same rooftop where it had all begun. Empire Tower, the place of her final confrontation with Harold. The city pulsed beneath her, alive and wounded. Daniel joined her silently, hands in his pockets. You think it's really over? He asked. She smiled faintly. Revenge ends when the truth stops hurting. That's not today, he nodded. So what now? Margaret turned toward the skyline, her eyes reflecting the flickering glow of distant sirens. Now, she said, we rebuild. The months that followed changed everything. Investigations expanded worldwide. Fletcher Holdings dissolved. New ethics laws were drafted in the wake of her revelations. And Margaret, the woman once mocked and ruined, became a reluctant symbol of integrity, reborn from ashes. She refused interviews. She declined awards, but one morning she received a handwritten letter. No name, no signature. Just one line. You taught me to listen before I judged. Thank you, Margaret smiled quietly. The words were simple, but they carried more weight than any apology Harold could have ever given. Because revenge, she realized, was never about destruction. It was about making people see. Months later, she opened a small consultancy, not in finance, but in rehabilitation. She worked with women who had been fired, silenced, or disgraced for speaking out. Her office walls bore no degrees, no trophies, only a single framed quote. The ones who lose everything often become the ones who change everything. Daniel helped manage the business, though he often teased her about being the saint of second chances. She didn't mind. Sometimes, she'd sit by the window, watching the rain slide down the glass, and think of the day Harold had asked her for financial advice as a joke. How far they'd come since then, and how poetic that his empire fell because a woman he underestimated decided to stand tall. Late one evening, as the rain turned the city to silver, Daniel entered her office. There's someone here to see you, he said. Margaret looked up. Who? He stepped aside. A young woman, no older than 25, nervously entered the room, the same fear in her eyes that Margaret once carried. I was told you help people who've been destroyed, she said softly. I don't know where else to go. Margaret rose, extending her hand with a gentle smile. You're already in the right place. And as thunder rumbled in the distance, the cycle came full circle, not one of vengeance, but of redemption. Because in a world that once mocked her voice, Margaret Collins had finally built a place where every voice, every her voice, could be heard.